The human figure in art. For millennia, art tells us stories. Stories are often about people, so to see people in art is quite understandable. From 500 years ago, during Renaissance times, Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man tells us of the proportions of the male figure. And then contemporary art, the work of Gavin Turk and his sculpture Pop. Pop is a sculpture of the artist, dressed as Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols in the same positions as Elvis Presley in the famous print by Andy Warhol. And perhaps the most famous sculpture of all, Michelangelo's David, a sculpture of King David after he slaughtered Goliath. David still holds the slingshot in his left hand. The sculpture is enormous. If one were to stand next to it, our heads would be its knees. Typically, men were shown in a dominant, strong position. In art, they are standing, the inverted triangle of the chest. Women in art were shown in a very different way, perhaps less virile and more fertile, and that's the purpose of this sculpture. Perhaps one of the oldest figurative sculptures ever found from 35,000 years ago. A large, round, fertile tummy and large breast. It's about fertility. Sandro Botticelli's The Birth of Venus is perhaps more about innocence and love. She's been quickly covered, but she's immune to this. She's a goddess. Her head is tilted to the side, so even though she stands like Michelangelo's David, she is submissive and not strong. We see this in the work of Titian's Venus of Urbino. Here, typically, the woman lies draped, flowing across the bed, and quite importantly, her head is tilted to the side. She is in a submissive position. What I have to show you next is rather confronting, and when first viewed was considered almost pornographic. Edouard Manet's Olympia. Perhaps different from Titian's Venus of Urbino, but not too different. It's still a naked woman lying across the bed, but there are two very important differences. In fact, when this was shown at the Louvre in Paris, women were known to faint. Men threw rotten tomatoes at it and eventually had to be moved to a different part of the gallery. Such were the protests. It's nothing to do with her servant or the cat at the end of the bed. The first thing to do is to do with her face and her head. She's not submissive. She stares defiantly at the viewer. Her head is upright, facing directly towards us. And not only is she staring at us, we know what her job is. The choker around her neck tells us that she is a prostitute. This is why it was considered so rebellious at the time. The work of Jenny Saville, a contemporary painter, is very much about the human body, her body. Even though she doesn't look like this, she lets us believe that she feels like this. Her work is concerned with how we view ourselves, and consequently, she enlarges areas of her body, and even her photography will squash up different shapes. Marc Chagall's Red Nude, a study in the female form from a male perspective. Kath Colwitt's Mother with Dead Child is something else. Her figure of the mother holding her dead child, pulling him into her, the white death mask of the boy we know he's already dead. Edgar Degas' Little Dancer is a celebration of the ballet dancer. A brass sculpture, but dressed in the clothes of the time. She is poised and delicate. Giacometti's figures, of course, are something else. Disproportionate, elongated, but they still are recognizable as the human figure, even though the proportions are incorrect. Millet's The Gleaners. You can feel the pain as they're bending down every day to pick up the scraps from the ground. Tamara Delempicka's Portrait of Madame M. She paints women as women see them, not as submissive, but as strong. Egon Schiele does something else. Perhaps he paints them as fragile. Men in art. William Blake's version of Isaac Newton. Intelligence, but with great strength. This is a painting of a human. It's called Premonition of Civil War. Perhaps it's symbolic of what war does to people. Perhaps she's female, we know this from the breast, and she's contorted in pain. Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, this time not so much surreal as more abstract, with the African face masks he was inspired by at the time, and the birth of Cubism himself, where he distracts and contorts the human figure. They're still very obviously women. Man or woman? Well, Umberto Boccioni's unique forms of continuity in space is about power and speed and dynamism. And if we look closely, we can see the proportions of a typical male, the high shoulders and the dominant position. Marcel Duchamp's new Descending a Staircase is also about movement. Abstracted like Picasso's, moving like Boccioni's, we can recognize the same proportions of the human figure. Similar to Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, the proportions remain, so we can discern a figure. In photography, Ernst Haas's surrealist photography, we can recognize the shapes of the figures. The image is still, but like Boccioni's sculpture, we sense implied movement. This is a human figure, this time surreal as opposed to abstracted. It's a photo montage, The Swan, perhaps a take on Swan Lake, the ballet. Fashion photography, Richard Avedon, poses with contrast. The fate woman next to the strong elephant. One of the most famous sculptors of all, and the most famous of sculptors was Auguste Rodin, and the thinker. His position is still dominant and strong, not flowing and submissive. Constantin Brancusi, who studied under Rodin in Paris. Brancusi, originally from Romania, spent 2 years walking all the way to Paris. He studied under Rodin for a while, but then took his sculpture and became the father of modern sculpture. He simplified the forms. Without the titles, we could understand that the left is torso of a young man, and on the right is torso of a young girl. We return to this idea of fertility and virility. On the right, the torso of the young girl is about fertility. She's similar to the old statue. She has a round belly and is about being fertile. On the left, the torso of the young man, his chest and the top of his hips, lets us realize that he's upright and strong. The sculpture, of course, is also a phallic symbol. Man or woman? Well, Henry Moore lets us decide by giving the sculpture breasts, and of course, that the traditional role of a woman seen in visual art of the time, she's draped and fluid and lying down. His king and queen, of course, are more symptomatic of the types of characters one would find in royalty. Upright, perhaps a little offish and distant, and certainly quite posh. Jacob Epstein's rock drill, and here's a reconstruction of it. It was since destroyed. Well, it's stylized, but it's still based in the same proportions of the human figure. You may have seen how it's influenced contemporary popular culture. The Star Wars battle droids. We can see the resemblance quite easily. Antony Gormley's Angel of the North. Well, this time contemporary sculpture ignores the rules of tradition. It's not a man standing upright and strong, it's a woman. If you were to stand next to her, your head would be about her ankles. Antony Gormley again. These human figures are much smaller, but so many of them, and they all occupy similar proportions. They are of the human. Zai Zaiwan's Descending Soul No. 2 isn't a sculpture at all. It's made of 14 panes of glass, each one painstakingly etched into. It gives the impression of 3 dimensions of a contorted figure. Francis Bacon's Studies. Andy Warhol's Elders. We saw Gavin Turk appropriate before. Damien Hirst's Virgin Mother. Brett Whiteley's Fluid Drawings. Mark Quinn's Uncomfortable Sculptures. Sean Lander's Silly, Surreal Artworks. Guanasang's Runner is a sculpture, but it's also photography. He takes photographs of the people and wraps the sculpture with the photographs. Ron Muick's Old Man. Almost hyper-realist, but the scale is wrong. Like Michelangelo's David, if you were to stand next to this man, you'd be looking him directly in the eyes. He's a giant, as is his Wild Man. Patricia Piccinini's sculptures, influenced by the work of scientists in genetic modification, are supposed to be abhorrent. We're supposed to be upset by them. It is rather a beautiful image, a mother and child. Spencer Tunick's work uses the human figure in a very different way. He literally uses the human figure, in this case, many hundreds, and of course naked. He positions people in places one wouldn't normally expect to find them, perhaps in a park or a house. The next slide concerns death, and I will show you an image of a corpse. From the Body Worlds exhibition. Is it sculpture? Is it art? Perhaps it's both. This is a cadaver, a corpse, a body that's been donated. It's had the skin removed in a process called plastination to embalm the body. It lets us understand the physicality of the human form, as does Antoine Bourdel's Hercules. You can see the stress behind the bow of the archer. Back to Rodin and the kiss. And here we see the king of sculpture himself gives us what we always expect. They're a man and a woman. The man and the woman are in an embrace. Is he kissing her or is she kissing him? Well, she is fluid in his arms. There are no verticals or horizontals. But he remains strong. Even though sitting, his chest is very vertical. He leans in. He is the dominant. She is submissive. Brancusi, again, who studied under Rodin, does something very different with his version of the kiss. We can still discern who's the male and who's the female. On the left, we see the woman. We know this because he gives her longer hair. He also gives her the more fertile belly. And of course, typically, the male is more dominant. Her arms go around his neck. His arms come up around and underneath her shoulders and he holds her. Similar, but a very typical position to be in. Gustave Courbet's The Desperate Man. Count Orlok in Murnau's Nosferatu. Essentially, Dracula. In movies we find many human figures. Robbie the Robot is of human form, an anthropomorphized robot. Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. Bai Ling in 2046. Or one of the most famous movies of its time in the 1950s, Seven Samurai. DC Comics give us the human figure in an alternate form. Robert Downey in Richard Linklater's A Scanner Darkly has been rotoscoped. He's a cross between animation and film. We find the human figure in all art, whether it be the Venus de Milo or the Aphrodite of Milos, or we look at the contemporary work of Julian Opie. We understand the proportions, and we can understand the stories and the characters because of it.